In a small, quiet town, a single act of racism sparks a chain of consequences no one could have predicted. When a black veteran walks into a local diner, he expects a simple meal. Instead, he's met with humiliation from the restaurant owner, a man whose prejudice blinds him to the gravity of his actions. What the owner doesn't know is that this incident isn't staying behind closed doors. Among the witnesses to this shameful act is none other than Donald Trump. His unexpected involvement is about to shake the foundations of this close-knit community. What happens next will uncover hidden biases, test the strength of a town's morals, and leave everyone questioning what justice truly means. If you're yet to subscribe and love stories of courage and resilience, please do. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and diesel as the bus pulled into the dusty terminal on Main Street. Marcus Ellis adjusted the duffel bag slung over his shoulder and stepped off, his boots crunching against the gravel. The heat of the southern sun pressed down on him like an old, familiar weight, but this was home. After 6 years of service, Marcus was finally back in the small town of Millbrook, a speck on the map in the heart of the South. As he stood there, the sights around him triggered a flood of memories. The rows of brick storefronts, the faded banners hanging from lampposts advertising the upcoming Founders' Day festival, and the imposing courthouse clock tower, all unchanged. The town looked the same, yet something felt different. Maybe it was him. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his ball cap, which bore the insignia of his unit, a proud reminder of his years in uniform. He caught a few glances from passers-by, some curious, some indifferent. A couple of old-timers on a bench nodded in recognition, offering a muttered, "Welcome back, son." "Good to be back," Marcus replied, forcing a smile. The truth was, Millbrook had always been a mixed bag for him. Growing up as one of the few black families in a predominantly white town wasn't easy. The Ellis family had earned respect in some circles, but faced quiet disdain in others. Leaving for the military had been his escape, a chance to prove himself beyond the town's narrow expectations. As he walked down the familiar streets, his stomach rumbled. He hadn't eaten since the bus transfer hours earlier. He spotted Reynolds' Grill at the corner of Main and Oak, its red and white sign as gaudy as ever. He hesitated. Reynolds' Grill had been a staple in Millbrook for as long as Marcus could remember. George Reynolds, the owner, was a larger-than-life figure in the town, known for his booming laugh and his no-nonsense attitude. But Marcus also remembered the whispers, stories of George's less-than-friendly behavior toward people who didn't look like him. "Man's gotta eat," Marcus muttered under his breath, pushing the thoughts aside. He stepped inside. The cool air conditioning hit him first, a welcome relief from the summer heat. The restaurant was bustling, a mix of families, workers on lunch breaks, and retirees sipping coffee. The walls were lined with photos of local history: the Millbrook High football team, a county fair, George Reynolds shaking hands with the mayor. Marcus found a seat near the window and waited. Minutes ticked by. At first he thought the staff might just be busy. A waitress walked past his table without a glance, then another. Marcus's brow furrowed. Other patrons were being served, their orders taken promptly. When a third waitress bypassed him, Marcus raised his hand. "Excuse me." Before he could finish, a heavy-set man in his late 50s appeared from behind the counter. George Reynolds himself. His white apron was stained, and his face was set in a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, well," George said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "Look who decided to grace us with his presence." The room seemed to quiet, conversations dropping to a murmur. Marcus felt the weight of a dozen eyes on him. "Good afternoon," Marcus replied evenly, trying to keep his tone calm. "I've been waiting for someone to take my order." George's smile tightened. "You sure you're in the right place, son? This ain't no soup kitchen." A ripple of laughter spread through the room. Marcus clenched his jaw, willing himself to stay composed. "I'm a paying customer," he said firmly. "Just like everyone else here." George leaned on the table, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "See, I run a respectable establishment here, and I don't need no trouble from folks like you." The room felt suffocating. Marcus's heartbeat thundered in his ears. He glanced around, noting the varied reactions of the other patrons. A middle-aged couple in the corner exchanged uneasy looks, clearly uncomfortable but saying nothing. A group of young men in the back chuckled, nudging each other as if enjoying the spectacle. And then there was the waitress, Emma, her name tag read, standing frozen near the kitchen door. Her expression was one of silent apology, her knuckles white as she clutched a tray. Marcus took a deep breath. I served this country, Mr. Reynolds, just like my father before me. I didn't fight overseas to come home and be treated like this. George straightened, his face hardening. You think that uniform makes you better than me? His voice rose, drawing more attention. This is my place, and I decide who gets served. The room fell silent. Marcus pushed his chair back and stood, towering over George by a few inches. He leaned in close, his voice steady and low. You don't have to like me, but you will respect me. Now, are you going to take my order, or should I leave? The tension was palpable. For a moment, it seemed like George might back down. But then, with a sneer, he barked, Get out of my restaurant! The words hung in the air like an explosion. Marcus stood there, his fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to say something, to fight back, but years of discipline held him in check. Instead, he turned on his heel and walked toward the door. As he reached for the handle, Emma's voice cut through the silence. Wait! Marcus turned, surprised. She hurried over, pressing a small piece of paper into his hand. I'm sorry, she whispered, her eyes darting nervously toward George. This isn't right. Marcus nodded, pocketing the paper without looking at it. He pushed open the door and stepped out into the sweltering afternoon, the stares of the diners burning into his back. Outside, Marcus leaned against the side of the building, his hands shaking. He pulled out the paper Emma had given him. It was her phone number, along with a hastily scribbled message. Please call me. We need to talk. As Marcus stood there, trying to process what had just happened, he didn't notice the figure watching him from an upstairs window. Behind the partially drawn blinds, a man in a dark suit stood with his arms crossed, a thoughtful expression on his face. He reached for his phone and typed a note. Millbrook, Reynolds Grill, story potential? The man's face was obscured, but his signature golden hair glinted in the afternoon sun. The night was humid, the air still thick with the day's heat, as Marcus sat on the front steps of his mother's modest home. The house, like much of Millbrook, was a relic of the past, with peeling paint and a porch swing that creaked with the slightest breeze. Marcus's mother had passed away a few years back, but the house remained, a tether to his childhood and the memories of simpler times. He pulled the paper Emma had given him from his pocket, running his thumb over the scrawled message. The encounter at Reynolds Grill played on a loop in his mind, each replay stoking the embers of anger that smoldered in his chest. Marcus stared at his phone for a moment before dialing. Hello? Emma's voice was hesitant but unmistakably kind. This is Marcus, he said. We met earlier today at the grill. I remember, Emma replied quickly. Thank you for calling. I wasn't sure if you would. Marcus could hear the nervousness in her voice, the way her words rushed as if she was afraid of being overheard. Why did you give me your number? He asked bluntly. There was a pause, and then Emma's voice softened. Because what happened today wasn't right. And it's not the first time George has done something like that. Marcus felt his jaw tighten. You mean this is normal for him? Unfortunately, yes, Emma admitted. He's been running that place for 20 years, and he thinks he can do whatever he wants. I've seen him turn people away, call them names. It's disgusting, but no one says anything. He's got connections in town, and people are afraid of him. Marcus leaned back against the steps, staring up at the starless sky. Why do you stay? Emma let out a bitter laugh. Good question. I guess because I didn't have anywhere else to go. My family's here and jobs are hard to come by. But I'm tired of it, Marcus. I'm tired of letting him get away with this. Her words hung in the air, heavy with frustration and guilt. Marcus felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of purpose. What can we do? He asked. The next day, Marcus found himself back at Reynolds Grill, not as a customer, but as an observer. He parked his truck across the street and watched the restaurant from the shadows, his military instincts kicking in. The lunch crowd was bustling, people coming and going, but Marcus's focus was on George. The man's larger-than-life presence dominated the room, his booming laugh echoing through the windows. Emma was there too, moving quickly between tables, her expression neutral, but her body language tense. Marcus noticed how George barked orders at her, how she flinched every time he came near. As the crowd began to thin, Marcus stepped out of his truck and crossed the street. He didn't plan to confront George again, not yet, but he needed to talk to Emma. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter than the day before. A few stragglers lingered over their meals, and the staff moved about cleaning tables. Emma spotted Marcus immediately, her eyes widening in surprise. She glanced toward the kitchen, where George's booming voice could be heard, then quickly made her way over. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice low. Marcus held up his hands in mock surrender. "Relax. I'm not here to cause trouble." Emma gave him a pointed look. "George will lose it if he sees you." "I'm not worried about him," Marcus said. "I just wanted to check in. Did you mean what you said last night?" Emma hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before nodding. "I did. But we have to be careful. If George finds out, he'll fire me. Or worse." Marcus leaned in, lowering his voice. "You don't have to deal with this alone. If you've got proof of what he's been doing, we can take it to the authorities. Or the media." Emma's eyes darted nervously around the room. "I've been keeping a record. Notes, photos, even some recordings, but it's risky. He's got friends in high places." Before Marcus could respond, the sound of heavy boots on tile made them both turn. George emerged from the kitchen, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Marcus. "Well, if it isn't my favorite customer," George drawled, his tone laced with sarcasm. "What brings you back? Thought you'd had enough of my hospitality." Marcus straightened, meeting George's gaze without flinching. "I'm just here to talk to Emma." George's smile twisted into a sneer. "Emma, huh? What's he want with you?" Emma's face turned pale, but she forced a shaky smile. "He was just asking about the menu, George. I was explaining the specials." George's eyes flicked between them, suspicion clouding his features. "That right?" "Yeah," Marcus said evenly. "I hear the pie's good. Thought I'd give it a try." George let out a harsh laugh. "Well, ain't that nice? Too bad we're fresh out." Marcus's fists clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Guess I'll come back another time." "You do that," George said, his voice cold. Outside, Marcus leaned against his truck, his heart pounding. He hated the way George spoke to him, the way he lorded over everyone in that restaurant. A few minutes later, Emma slipped out the back door, a folder clutched tightly in her hands. She hurried over to Marcus, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "Here," she said, thrusting the folder at him. Marcus opened it, his eyes scanning the contents. Photos of handwritten logs, receipts marked with racial slurs, and a flash drive labeled audio. "I've been collecting this for years," Emma said quietly, "but I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't think anyone would care." Marcus's grip tightened on the folder. "They'll care now." That evening, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, the folder spread out before him. He plugged the flash drive into his laptop and clicked on the first audio file. George's voice filled the room, laced with venom. "I don't care if he's got a medal on his chest. He's not welcome here. This is my place, and I don't serve his kind." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He played another file, and another, each one more damning than the last. By the time he was done, Marcus's hands were shaking with rage. His phone buzzed on the table. It was Emma. "Well?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "It's enough," Marcus said. "It's more than enough." "What now?" Marcus looked at the folder, then out the window at the darkened streets of Millbrook. He didn't have an answer yet, but one thing was clear. George Reynolds wasn't going to get away with this anymore. The next day dawned with a deceptive calm. Millbrook bustled with its usual morning routines. Shopkeepers swept their storefronts, children chased each other on bicycles, and retirees gathered at the park to exchange gossip. But Marcus couldn't shake the heaviness in his chest as he drove toward Main Street. The folder of evidence Emma had handed him sat in the passenger seat, its contents burned into his mind. The audio files had replayed in his head all night, George's voice dripping with hatred. Marcus knew exposing Reynolds' grill wouldn't be easy. but he wasn't about to back down. He parked near the courthouse and took a deep breath. Today wasn't about revenge. It was about standing up for what was right. Marcus stepped into Reynolds' Grill just after the lunch rush. The atmosphere was quieter than usual, but a few familiar faces dotted the tables. George was at the counter, wiping it down with slow, deliberate movements. He looked up as Marcus walked in, his eyes narrowing. "Well, well," George said loudly, drawing the attention of the remaining patrons. "If it isn't my favorite customer back for another round." A ripple of laughter spread through the room, but Marcus didn't flinch. He walked straight to the counter and stood tall, his military posture cutting an imposing figure. "I'm here to speak with you, George," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. George leaned against the counter, smirking. "Oh, you hear that, folks? The man wants a word with me. I wonder what about." Marcus ignored the chuckles from the back of the room. "I have something you need to hear." George crossed his arms, his smirk widening. "Is that so? Well, I've got a restaurant to run, soldier boy, so why don't you take your business elsewhere?" Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, holding it up for George to see. He tapped the screen, and George's voice blared from the speaker. "I don't care if he's got a medal on his chest, he's not welcome here." The room went silent. Patrons froze mid-bite, their heads snapping toward George. The smirk on George's face faltered for the briefest moment before twisting into a snarl. "You think you can come in here and play your little games?" George growled. Marcus locked eyes with him. "I'm not playing games. This is who you are, George, and everyone's gonna know it." The confrontation escalated quickly. George's face turned red as he slammed his hand on the counter. "You think you can just waltz in here and ruin my reputation?" he barked. "I've been running this place for 20 years, and no one's complained about me. Not once." Marcus kept his voice steady, refusing to be intimidated. "That's because people like Emma are too scared to speak up, but not anymore." At the mention of Emma's name, George's expression darkened. His voice dropped to a dangerous growl. "You leave Emma out of this." "She's already in it," Marcus shot back, "because she had the courage to do what you've been hoping no one would. Tell the truth." A few patrons began whispering among themselves, their unease evident. Some grabbed their belongings and slipped out the door, not wanting to be part of the unfolding drama. George, sensing the shift, raised his voice. "This is my establishment. I've got the right to serve, or not serve, whoever I damn well please." Marcus stepped closer, his voice sharp. "And you'll answer for it." The bell above the door jingled, and 2 police officers walked in. Their presence silenced the room further. George waved them over with exaggerated relief. "Officers, glad you're here. This man is disturbing my business." The taller of the 2 officers, a man with graying hair and a weary expression, looked between Marcus and George. "What's going on here?" George gestured wildly. "This man's been causing a scene, trying to smear my name." Marcus turned to the officers, his voice calm but resolute. "I came here to confront him about his racist behavior, which I can prove." The officers exchanged a glance, clearly uncomfortable. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. One officer stepped forward. "Mr. Ellis, maybe it's best if we take this outside." Marcus met his gaze evenly. "Why? So he can keep pretending he's the victim?" "No. Everyone in here needs to know who this man really is." George, emboldened by the officer's presence, leaned over the counter. "You hear that, folks? He thinks he's some kind of hero. Just another loudmouth looking for attention." Marcus's temper flared, but he held it in check. Instead, he pulled out a small speaker from his pocket and placed it on the counter. With a press of a button, the next audio file played. "I don't care if they call me a racist. This is my place, and I'll run it how I see fit." Gasps erupted from the patrons still seated, their disbelief evident. One elderly woman shook her head and muttered, "That's disgusting." George's face twisted in rage. "Turn that off." Marcus didn't move. "Why? Afraid people will finally see who you are?" The officers stepped between them, their hands raised. "All right, that's enough. Mr. Ellis, come with us." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he let the officers guide him toward the door. As they left, the whispers of the remaining patrons followed them. Outside, the officers led Marcus to the sidewalk, one of them placing a hand on his shoulder. "Listen," the older officer said, his tone softening. "I get what you're trying to do, but this isn't the way." "What other way is there?" Marcus shot back. "People like him have been getting away with this for too long." The officer sighed. "You've got proof, right? Take it to the right channels. Let the courts handle it." Marcus stared at him for a moment before nodding. "I'll do that, but this isn't over." As Marcus walked back to his truck, he felt the weight of the confrontation settle on his shoulders. He knew this was just the beginning. Across the street, a sleek black SUV idled by the curb, its tinted windows obscuring the occupants. Inside, a familiar figure watched the scene unfold with a calculating expression. Donald Trump tapped his fingers against the armrest, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Get me the details on that guy," he said to his aide in the passenger seat. "I want to know everything about him." The aide nodded, typing furiously on their tablet. Trump leaned back in his seat, a sly smile playing at his lips. "This is going to be interesting." The morning after the confrontation at Reynolds' Grill, Marcus awoke to the sound of his phone buzzing incessantly on the nightstand. He groggily reached for it, his heart sinking as he saw the dozens of missed calls and unread messages. The first message was from Emma. "It's everywhere. Stay strong." Confused, Marcus opened his social media app and immediately saw what she meant. A video of the confrontation had been posted online, captured by one of the patrons. It had gone viral overnight, racking up thousands of views and comments. The caption read, "Veteran humiliated by racist restaurant owner in Millbrook. When will this stop?" Marcus scrolled through the comments, a mix of outrage and vitriol. Some people were rallying behind him, calling for justice and vowing to boycott Reynolds' Grill. Others defended George, accusing Marcus of stirring trouble for attention. He tossed the phone onto the bed and rubbed his temples. He hadn't asked for any of this attention, but now that it was here, he had no choice but to face it head-on. Later that morning, Marcus sat on his porch, sipping a cup of coffee and trying to collect his thoughts. A knock on the door startled him. When he opened it, Emma stood there, clutching a brown paper bag. "I brought breakfast," she said with a small smile. "Thanks," Marcus said, stepping aside to let her in. They sat at the kitchen table, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. "You've seen the video?" Marcus asked finally. Emma nodded. "It's all over. People in town are talking. Some are angry at George, but others, well, you know how this place is." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant. "I didn't plan for any of this. I just wanted to stand up to him, show him he couldn't keep treating people like that." Emma reached across the table, her hand brushing his. "You did the right thing, Marcus. And now people are listening. That's a start." The sound of tires crunching on gravel drew their attention. Marcus looked out the window and saw a group of people gathering on the street in front of his house. "What the?" he muttered, standing up. When he stepped outside, he was greeted by a mix of familiar and unfamiliar faces. Some were neighbors, others strangers. One man held a homemade sign that read, "Justice for Marcus." A woman stepped forward, her voice firm. "We saw the video, Marcus. We're here to support you." Marcus was momentarily speechless. He hadn't expected this kind of reaction, especially in Millbrook. Emma joined him on the porch, her expression a mix of surprise and hope. Maybe this town isn't as stuck in its ways as we thought. As the small crowd began to disperse, Marcus felt a flicker of determination reignite within him. He wasn't alone in this fight. Emma stayed behind, helping him plan their next steps. They decided to take the evidence Emma had collected to a lawyer in the neighboring city, a civil rights attorney known for taking on tough cases. By the afternoon, they were sitting in the cramped office of Joanne Carter, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with a no-nonsense demeanor. "This is damning," Joanne said, flipping through the folder. "If this goes public, it won't just hurt George Reynolds. It'll send a message to every business owner who thinks they can get away with this kind of behavior." Marcus frowned. "How do we make sure it doesn't backfire? I don't want this turning into a circus." Joanne gave him a reassuring smile. "Leave that to me. But be prepared. The backlash is going to get worse before it gets better." Back in Millbrook, the backlash had already begun. George Reynolds wasn't taking the growing outrage lying down. That evening, he held an impromptu press conference outside the restaurant, flanked by a group of his most loyal customers. This is my establishment, George declared, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the small crowd. And I've always run it with pride and respect. These baseless accusations are an attack on my character and my business. A reporter raised a hand. What about the audio recordings that have surfaced? Do you deny making those statements? George's face darkened. Those recordings are fake. Somebody's trying to smear me. I've served this community for decades, and I won't be brought down by lies. The town became a battlefield of opinions overnight. Social media exploded with hashtags like Justice for Marcus and hashtag Support Reynolds. Protesters gathered outside the grill, holding signs and chanting for change. Counter-protesters showed up too, some waving Confederate flags and shouting slogans about tradition and freedom of speech. Marcus watched the chaos unfold from a distance, torn between frustration and resolve. Emma tried to keep his spirits up, but he could see the toll it was taking on her too. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Emma broke the silence. "Do you think it'll ever really change?" she asked quietly. Marcus stared out at the darkened street, the distant sound of protesters still echoing in the air. "I don't know, but if we don't try, nothing ever will." Meanwhile, in a luxurious hotel suite on the edge of town, Donald Trump was watching everything unfold with great interest. His aide placed a tablet on the desk in front of him, displaying the latest news coverage. "Things are escalating," the aide said. "The protests are getting bigger, and it's drawing national attention." Trump leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "This has potential," he said, "but we need to be smart about how we handle it." The aide hesitated. "You really think getting involved in this is a good idea? It's a powder keg." Trump smirked. "Exactly. And I've always been good at lighting fuses." The protests outside Reynolds Grill had reached a fever pitch. The once quiet streets of Millbrook were now flooded with journalists, activists, and onlookers, each drawn by the story that had spiraled into a national spectacle. The clamor of chanting voices, the hum of news vans, and the glare of camera lights turned the small town into a circus. Marcus stood on the edge of the crowd, his arms crossed, his face a mask of determination. He had hoped for justice, but now he felt the weight of something much larger pressing down on him. "I didn't sign up for this," he muttered to Emma, who stood by his side. Emma placed a hand on his arm. "It's bigger than us now. People are listening, Marcus. That's what matters." But Marcus wasn't so sure. Amid the sea of signs and slogans, he noticed how quickly some had shifted the focus. It was no longer just about what had happened to him. It was about broader political agendas, with factions on both sides using the moment for their own purposes. Meanwhile, Donald Trump watched from the comfort of his hotel suite, sipping a Diet Coke as the latest news coverage played on the television. The split screen showed the chaos in Millbrook on one side and a panel of pundits on the other, debating the implications of the unfolding drama. "This is perfect," Trump said, leaning forward. His aide, a young man with glasses and a nervous energy, hesitated. "How do you want to approach this? If you make a statement, it could go either way." Trump waved a hand dismissively. "This isn't about taking sides. It's about making an impact. People love a comeback story, especially when it's tied to me." He stood, pacing the room with his trademark confidence. "Reach out to Marcus Ellis, quietly. Let him know I'm interested in meeting with him." The aide blinked. "You want to meet with him?" Trump smirked. "Of course. He's the center of all this, isn't he? I just need to make sure he's on board before I step in." Marcus was surprised when the call came. He was sitting at home, sifting through more messages of support and hate, when his phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but he answered anyway. "Marcus Ellis?" "Yes. Who's this?" "This is Andrew Greer. I'm with a private team working on behalf of Donald Trump. He'd like to meet with you." Marcus frowned, certain he'd misheard. "Trump? As in Donald Trump?" "Yes," Greer said, his tone measured. "He's been following your story and believes it's an important moment for the country. He'd like to discuss how he can support you." Marcus was silent for a moment, his mind racing. Why would Trump care about what's happening here? Greer chuckled. "Because it's not just about Millbrook anymore. This has captured national attention. and Mr. Trump believes it's a story worth engaging with. Marcus felt a pang of suspicion. And what does he want from me? Just a conversation, Greer replied smoothly. To hear your perspective and explore how he might help bring about a resolution. The details of the meeting would be entirely private unless you choose otherwise. Marcus hesitated. The idea of sitting down with Trump seemed absurd, but he couldn't deny the potential influence Trump brought to the table. All right, Marcus said finally. Let's set it up. The meeting took place at an upscale hotel just outside town. Marcus arrived dressed simply in jeans and a button-down shirt, his military posture unmistakable as he strode through the lobby. Emma insisted on coming with him, sitting in the car outside as a precaution. Trump's team ushered Marcus into a private conference room, where Trump sat at the head of the table, his golden hair impeccably styled, and his presence as commanding as ever. "Marcus," Trump boomed, standing to greet him with a firm handshake. "It's an honor to meet you. What you're doing is incredible, really incredible." Marcus took a seat, studying Trump carefully. "I'm not sure what you think I'm doing." Trump chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "You're standing up for what's right, and people are noticing. That's the kind of story America needs right now. A hero who's not afraid to speak the truth." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "And you want to help?" "I do," Trump said, his tone earnest. "Look, I know people have their opinions about me, but this isn't about politics. It's about doing the right thing. George Reynolds? That guy's a dinosaur, stuck in the past. What he did to you is unacceptable, and I want to make sure the world knows where I stand on that." Marcus was skeptical. "So, what's the plan?" Trump leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "We go public. You and me, standing side by side, showing that America can come together even in the face of division. I make a statement, call out the racism, and support your fight for justice." Marcus frowned. "And what do you get out of this?" Trump's smile didn't waver. "The truth is, Marcus, I see a chance to unite people. That's what I've always been about, bringing people together. And let's be honest, when you win, I win. It's a win-win." Back in Millbrook, the news of the impending collaboration between Marcus and Trump spread like wildfire. The reactions were predictably polarizing, with some praising the move as a step toward unity and others accusing Trump of opportunism. Emma was more skeptical than anyone. "Do you really think he's sincere?" she asked Marcus as they sat in his kitchen. Marcus shrugged. "I don't know. But if his involvement means getting justice and shining a bigger spotlight on what's happening here, maybe it's worth it." Emma nodded slowly. "Just be careful. He's a master at controlling the narrative." The day of the press conference arrived, and the town square was packed. Protesters, supporters, journalists, and curious locals filled the space, their voices blending into a cacophony of anticipation. A makeshift stage had been set up in front of the courthouse, with flags waving in the background. Marcus stood backstage, his stomach churning with nerves. Trump approached him, clapping a hand on his shoulder. "You ready, Marcus? This is your moment." "It's not just about me," Marcus said firmly. Trump nodded, a glint of approval in his eyes. "Exactly. That's what makes it so powerful." The press conference began with Trump stepping to the podium, his presence commanding the crowd's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice ringing out, "we're here today to confront an issue that's been dividing this nation for far too long. What happened to Marcus Ellis was wrong, plain and simple, and it's time we stand together to say, enough is enough." The crowd erupted into applause, though there were pockets of dissent. Trump gestured for Marcus to join him at the podium. As Marcus stepped forward, the applause grew louder. Marcus gripped the edges of the podium, his voice steady as he spoke. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's ever been told they don't belong, everyone who's ever been treated as less than. Today, we say no more." The crowd roared in approval, and for a moment, Marcus felt the weight on his shoulders lighten. The press conference had lit a fuse, and the explosion was felt far beyond Millbrook. The collaboration between Marcus and Trump became a polarizing headline, dominating news cycles for days. Cable news stations dissected every angle of the story, from Trump's unexpected stance to Marcus's decision to stand alongside him. In the town itself, the divide deepened. Millbrook, once a sleepy southern enclave, now found itself at the center of a national conversation. Streets once lined with American flags and porch swings were now clogged with protest signs, news vans, and a growing influx of activists. The tension simmered, like a pot on the verge of boiling over. Marcus stood on the sidewalk in front of Reynolds' Grill, staring at the building that had become the epicenter of the conflict. A line of protesters marched back and forth, their chants echoing through the humid afternoon air. "Justice for Marcus! Boycott Reynolds' Grill!" The windows of the restaurant were dark, the curtains drawn. George Reynolds hadn't reopened since the video went viral, but his presence loomed large. He'd been spotted around town, glaring at the protests from a distance, but he hadn't spoken publicly since his defiant press conference. "Marcus!" The voice pulled him from his thoughts. He turned to see Emma approaching, her face flushed from the heat and the tension of the day. "You shouldn't be out here alone," she said, glancing nervously at the growing crowd. Marcus shook his head. "I'm not afraid of him or anyone else." Emma frowned, her voice dropping. "It's not just George. There are people in this town who won't take kindly to what you're doing. You've seen the threats online." Marcus sighed. He had seen them. The hateful messages accusing him of being a troublemaker, a liar, even a traitor to his own town. But he refused to let fear dictate his actions. "If I back down now, everything we fought for means nothing," he said firmly. As the protests grew, so did the opposition. A counter-protest formed across the street, a line of people holding signs that read, "Support local business. Keep Millbrook great. Freedom of choice." The two groups shouted at each other from opposite sides of the road, the tension crackling like static electricity. Police officers stood between them, their faces grim as they tried to maintain order. The media lapped it up. Reporters moved between the groups, capturing sound bites and dramatic footage to feed the insatiable 24-hour news cycle. That evening, Marcus sat in his living room, exhausted. Emma was on the couch, flipping through channels as every station replayed the press conference. "It's everywhere," she said, gesturing to the screen. "I don't think I've seen Millbrook mentioned this much in my entire life." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes closed. "I just want it to mean something. All this attention, all this chaos, it has to lead to real change." Emma hesitated before speaking. "Do you think Trump really cares about change, or is this just another way for him to stay in the spotlight?" Marcus opened his eyes, staring at the ceiling. "I don't know, but for now his spotlight is helping us. And if he's serious about standing against people like George, I'm willing to take the risk." Across town, George Reynolds was pacing his living room, his face red with frustration. "They're ruining my business," he shouted, slamming his fist on the table. His wife, a quiet woman with a nervous demeanor, watched him from across the room. "Maybe you should just apologize, George. Admit you were wrong and try to move on." George whirled on her, his voice venomous. "Apologize? For what? For running my own damn restaurant the way I see fit?" She flinched but didn't respond. George grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the counter and poured himself a drink. "This isn't over," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "I'll show them. I'll show all of them." The protests reached a breaking point the next day. A group of counter-protesters marched across the police line, their shouts escalating into angry confrontations. Signs were ripped from hands, fists flew, and chaos erupted. The police scrambled to break up the fight, but the damage was done. Marcus arrived just as the scuffle was ending, the crowd dispersing under the weight of flashing lights and stern warnings. He spotted Emma in the distance, helping a protester who had been knocked to the ground. "Are you okay?" he asked, rushing over to her. She nodded, brushing dirt from her clothes. "It's getting worse. People are angrier than ever." Marcus surveyed the scene, his jaw tight. This wasn't what he'd wanted. He'd hoped for unity, for a chance to shine a light on injustice, but now the town felt more divided than ever. Back in his hotel suite, Trump watched the footage of the clash with a frown. His aide stood nearby, waiting nervously for his reaction. "This isn't the narrative I wanted," Trump said, his tone sharp. The aide nodded. "The situation is spiraling. If it gets worse, it could reflect poorly on your involvement." Trump rubbed his chin thoughtfully. We need to take control of the story. Call the media outlets. Set up an exclusive interview, just me and Marcus. It's time to pivot. The aide hesitated. Do you think Marcus will go for it? Trump smirked. He will. He's smart enough to know he needs me as much as I need him. When Marcus received the call, he was initially hesitant. The idea of another high-profile appearance, especially after the chaos of the past few days, made his stomach churn. But Emma convinced him otherwise. If Trump's willing to use his platform to keep this story alive, it might be worth it, she said. You'll get to control the narrative, tell your side of things, without the chaos. Marcus sighed. All right, let's do it. The interview aired live from Millbrook's town hall, the two figures seated side by side on a stage surrounded by cameras. Trump, as always, was confident and charismatic, his tone measured as he spoke about the importance of confronting injustice. Marcus, by contrast, was raw and heartfelt, speaking directly to the pain of discrimination and the need for accountability. The combination was electric. The audience hung on every word, the contrast between the two men only amplifying the message. For a brief moment, it seemed like unity was possible. The momentum from the interview rippled across the nation. Marcus had spoken with raw emotion, his words striking a chord with millions. Trump's unexpected stance had added an explosive twist, forcing even his detractors to admit that he was shining a spotlight on the issue in Millbrook. But not everyone was satisfied. George Reynolds watched the broadcast from the back of his darkened restaurant, his lips twisted into a sneer. His business had already suffered significant losses as protesters boycotted the grill. Suppliers were canceling contracts, and loyal customers were becoming scarce. This is a witch hunt, George growled, pacing the room. All because of that damn video and a bunch of lies. He paused, glancing at a photo on the wall of his father handing him the keys to the restaurant decades ago. To George, this place wasn't just a business. It was his legacy, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it from him. With a heavy sigh, he grabbed a bottle from the counter and poured himself another drink, muttering under his breath. The morning after the interview, Marcus stood outside his house, staring at the growing crowd on his street. Protesters and supporters alike had gathered, chanting slogans and waving signs. Emma approached him with a look of concern. Have you seen the news? Reynolds Grill is reopening today. Marcus frowned. After all this? He's doubling down? Emma nodded. And he's holding a press conference, claiming he's been unfairly targeted. Marcus clenched his jaw. He had hoped George might admit his wrongdoing and make amends, but instead the man seemed determined to dig in his heels. What do we do? Emma asked. We confront him, Marcus said without hesitation. If he's going to keep lying, we need to make sure the truth comes out, once and for all. The air outside Reynolds Grill was charged with tension as Marcus arrived with Emma by his side. A crowd of protesters stood across the street, chanting and holding signs, while a smaller group of counter-protesters gathered near the entrance, waving American flags and shouting slogans. Police officers were stationed nearby, their presence a reminder of how volatile the situation had become. George stood on the restaurant steps, a microphone in hand, addressing a cluster of reporters. His face was flushed, his voice defiant. I have served this community for over 20 years, George declared. And now, because of lies and smear campaigns, my livelihood is under attack. I've done nothing wrong, and I won't apologize for standing my ground. Marcus pushed through the crowd, his presence drawing immediate attention. Cameras swiveled to capture the moment, reporters whispering furiously into their microphones. George, Marcus called out, his voice cutting through the noise. George turned, his expression darkening as he spotted Marcus. Oh, look who decided to show up, he sneered. Here to play the victim some more? Marcus stepped closer, his gaze steady. I'm not here to play anything. I'm here to show people who you really are. The crowd fell silent as Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. You want to talk about lies? Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. Let's hear it straight from you. He tapped the screen, and George's voice blared from the speaker. I don't care if he's got a medal on his chest. He's not welcome here. This is my place, and I don't serve his kind. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The counter-protesters froze, their expressions ranging from shock to unease. Even George seemed momentarily thrown off balance, his face reddening as the recording played on. "This is the man you're defending," Marcus continued, his voice rising. "A man who built his business on hate and exclusion, and now he's trying to play the victim because he's finally being held accountable." The crowd erupted into murmurs, the reporters scrambling to capture the scene. George stepped forward, his fists clenched. "Those recordings are fake," he shouted. "This is all a setup." "They're not fake," another voice called out. All eyes turned to Emma, who stepped forward with a folder in hand. "I worked here for years," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I've seen what George is capable of, and I've been documenting it." She held up the folder. "Receipts, notes, photos, it's all here. The truth about what's been happening at Reynolds Grill." George's composure shattered. "You little traitor," he bellowed, pointing a finger at Emma. "You've got no loyalty, no respect." "No respect?" Emma shot back, her voice rising. "You think you deserve respect after the way you've treated people? You humiliated Marcus, and he's not the only one. This ends today, George." The crowd was buzzing now, the tide visibly turning. Some of George's defenders began slipping away, their faces pale with embarrassment. Marcus stepped closer to George, his voice low but firm. "It's over. You can keep lying or you can face the truth and take responsibility." For a moment, George seemed to deflate. The bravado faded, replaced by a flicker of fear and desperation. But then his jaw tightened, and he straightened his shoulders. "I'll see you in court," he spat, before turning and storming into the restaurant. As George disappeared, the crowd erupted into cheers. Protesters waved their signs triumphantly, and reporters rushed to interview Marcus and Emma. Trump's black SUV pulled up to the scene just as the energy reached its peak. He stepped out, flanked by his aides, and made his way toward Marcus. "Marcus," Trump said, extending a hand, "you handled that beautifully. This is the kind of courage America needs." Marcus shook his hand, his expression unreadable. "This isn't over yet. He's still fighting back." Trump smiled knowingly. "Let him fight. He's already lost." That evening, the footage of the confrontation at Reynolds Grill was broadcast nationwide, solidifying Marcus's position as a symbol of resilience and justice. George's threats of legal action faded in the face of mounting evidence, and within weeks, Reynolds Grill was shuttered, its windows boarded up. For Marcus, it wasn't just a victory. It was a turning point. The fight had revealed the depths of the challenges still facing communities like Millbrook, but it had also shown the power of standing together against injustice. The weeks that followed the showdown at Reynolds Grill brought a mix of closure and transformation to Millbrook. The restaurant, once a centerpiece of the town, now sat silent and empty, its faded red and white sign a stark reminder of the battle waged there. For Marcus, life didn't immediately return to normal. He wasn't sure it ever would. He'd become something of a local celebrity, and with that came both praise and criticism. Supporters often stopped him on the street to thank him for his courage, while others crossed the road to avoid him or muttered insults under their breath. But through it all, Marcus held his head high. The truth had come out, and that was what mattered most. One morning, Marcus found himself back on his mother's porch, sipping coffee and watching the town slowly come to life. Emma joined him, carrying a small stack of newspapers. "You've made the front page again," she said with a grin, handing him one of the papers. Marcus glanced at the headline. "Justice in Millbrook. Veteran Sparks Movement for Change." He set the paper aside, shaking his head. "I didn't do this for attention." Emma sat beside him, her expression thoughtful. "I know, but sometimes attention is what it takes to make people listen." Marcus nodded slowly, staring out at the street. "Do you think things will really change? Or is this just a moment?" Emma leaned back, her gaze steady. "Change doesn't happen all at once. But you've started something, Marcus. People are talking, questioning things they've never questioned before. That's the first step." As the days passed, tangible signs of progress began to emerge. A local activist group invited Marcus to speak at a community forum, where residents discussed ways to address racism and inequality in Millbrook. Emma, too, found a new purpose. She quit her job at Reynolds Grill and took up a position with a nonprofit dedicated to promoting racial equity and workers' rights. The folder of evidence she had compiled became a cornerstone of the organization's efforts to hold local businesses accountable. "I never thought I'd be doing something like this," Emma admitted one evening as she and Marcus worked on a presentation for the nonprofit. Marcus smiled. "You've always had it in you. You just needed the right moment." Meanwhile, George Reynolds's fall from grace was swift and decisive. Lawsuits piled up against him, including one from Marcus himself for discrimination. George's few remaining allies in town distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with his toxic reputation. Eventually, George left Millbrook altogether, selling the building that once housed his restaurant. Rumors swirled about where he'd gone, but most people didn't care. For Marcus, the lawsuit wasn't about revenge. It was about setting a precedent. When the settlement finally came through, he donated a significant portion of the money to local organizations fighting for justice. Donald Trump, true to form, capitalized on the story's momentum. He frequently referenced Marcus and Millbrook in speeches and interviews, framing the incident as a testament to the power of standing up for what's right. While some questioned Trump's motives, Marcus chose to focus on the bigger picture. His partnership with Trump had been unexpected and, at times, uneasy, but it had amplified his message in ways he never could have achieved alone. At a final joint event in Washington, D.C., Trump praised Marcus as a true American hero. Marcus, in turn, spoke candidly about the work that still needed to be done. "This isn't about me," he said, addressing the audience. "It's about building a future where no one has to fight this fight again. And that starts with each of us, in our communities, standing up for what's right." Back in Millbrook, life gradually settled into a new rhythm. The protests died down, the media moved on to other stories, and the town began to heal. But the impact of Marcus's actions lingered. The community forums became a regular occurrence, drawing people from all walks of life to share their experiences and ideas for change. Businesses implemented new policies to ensure fairness and inclusivity. And while not everyone embraced the changes, the progress was undeniable. One quiet evening, Marcus sat alone on the porch, reflecting on everything that had happened. The journey had been exhausting, but it had also been worth it. He thought of his mother, who had always taught him to stand tall in the face of adversity. He thought of the men and women he'd served with in the military, who had fought for a country that didn't always live up to its promises. And he thought of the future, the children growing up in Millbrook, who might one day inherit a town that was just a little bit kinder, a little bit fairer. Emma stepped onto the porch, holding 2 glasses of iced tea. "Lost in thought?" she asked, handing him a glass. Marcus smiled. "Just thinking about how far we've come." Emma sat beside him, her gaze thoughtful. "And how far we still have to go." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun dip below the horizon. For the first time in what felt like forever, Marcus felt a sense of peace. The fight wasn't over. But for now, it was enough to know that they had made a difference. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing. I put a lot of time into crafting these heartfelt narratives, and your support means the world. Thank you for being part of this journey.